Hello, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today. I invite Professor Mona Minka, one of the directors of the Allied Project, to introduce our lovely speaker we have today.
Hello, everyone, and welcome. I hope everybody is staying warm and cozy and is ready to enjoy this upcoming event. So today we have a really special topic. Ariel Lesnick is actually a doctoral student here at Northeastern, but also the director at Wentworth in the Disability Resource Center. And please correct me, Ariel, if I am incorrect. I had the pleasure of meeting Ariel like a year ago when Allied Project was in its beginning stages. And today, Ariel will be talking about claiming disability as an identity. I think this is a very important topic, and I really look forward to hearing what Ariel has to say. So thank you very much, and I pass the microphone on to you.
Thanks, Mona. I really appreciate it. And like I said, it's great to see so many people here on a snow day. I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen. Okay, I can start. Okay, great. Awesome. Hi, everyone. So thanks so much for coming. My name is Ariel. I use she, her, her series pronouns. I am currently a Northeastern doctoral candidate in the Graduate School of Education, but previously I worked at Northeastern's Disability Resource Center, and now I'm just down the street at Wentworth Institute of Technology as the Director of Student Accessibility Services and Academic Support. Okay, I just wanted to provide a brief background before delving into my position within the disability community. And I want to start with the disability rights movement. The disability rights movement is a global social justice movement, and in North America specifically, it was heavily inspired by the civil rights movement for Black Americans, and their activism was really framed using that same terminology of minority groups and civil rights. Some of the earliest actions during this movement led to the passing of Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. I know that's a mouthful, sometimes just called 504. It's the first disability civil rights law to be enacted in the United States. It prohibits discrimination against people with disabilities in programs that receive federal financial assistance. So even after this legislation was passed, activists staged multi-day sit-in protests to really push lawmakers to enforce the policies that they had passed. And then that's 1973. It wasn't until 1990 that the Americans with Disabilities Act, or ADA, was passed, which continued to ensure protection for people with disabilities from exclusion and unequal treatment in schools, jobs, and the community at large. The disability rights movement that I keep talking about, it's an intersectional movement. It affects people of all races, ages, and sexual orientation. There's a quote I like from Bell that says, very succinctly, no one form of oppression is a base for all others, yet all are connected within a system that makes them possible. And there's an image to the right of a disability independence parade in 1993 from Disability Pride, New York City. So where do I come in? When I was an undergrad student at Wesleyan University, I received my first disability diagnosis of bipolar 2 following my sophomore year of college. And this led to a total shift in my perception of myself. But at the same time, it felt really clarifying to have a label because it meant it was something I could look into. It was something that came with resources that I could research. But having little to no education on the history of disability rights before that, I became a student advocate for the inclusion of disability studies as a course cluster within my major that I was already in, which is American Studies. And then inspired and empowered really by that education, I joined the Wesleyan Students for Disability Rights student group. And it was really in that group that I began to compare my experience with my peers. And I found that my, all-encompassing embrace for my diagnosis and claiming my space in the disability community wasn't really the norm. So nearing graduation, I look back at my college experience and I realized how significant this new identity marker had become for me and how crucial my work with the Accessibility Services Office on campus was in ensuring my successful completion of my degree. I started receiving academic accommodations when I gave them documentation, and I was told very explicitly that it was not an unfair advantage, but rather something I was entitled to that was protected by the law. And I knew this for sure, that without the accommodation and that office's support in taking a medical leave of absence, I would not have been able to graduate. So I near graduation, and I look back and I think that I want to give back to this community and hopefully offer the same level of support I had received myself. So I continued on, didn't leave school, and I went on to earn a Master's of Education in Educational Leadership and Policy Studies with a focus on higher ed admin. And then I began working at Northeastern's Disability Resource Center, and I enrolled in the Doctorate of Education program at Northeastern's Graduate School of Education not long afterwards. So as you can tell, my professional and academic career is inextricably linked to my identity as a disabled person. This concept is a really central tenet to disability activism, and that's exemplified in the rallying cry, "Nothing about us without us." Or in other words, no policy should be implemented for a group without the full participation by the members of that group who would be most affected by that policy. So the Latin roots of this slogan have been traced back to Central Europe in the 1500s, and in the US can be seen as analogous to the Revolutionary War era's "no taxation without representation." That's that same thread. And in disability activism, a really well-known example of using this slogan were the members of the Gallaudet University community, which is a school for the deaf and hard of hearing, who successfully pushed for deaf leadership in 1988 with their Deaf President Now movement. And there exists a debate within the disability community about language. So the first push was for something called person first language. So a person with disabilities or a person with autism. And that was really meant, to emphasize people's humanity before this diagnostic label. But in response, many felt that this was actually counterintuitive to the way that they identified, especially for those whose disability identity is their central means of identification and how they're perceived in society. So now we come to a third shift in what we sometimes call identity first language. So in the example, for our current best practice, is something called person preferred or person centered language. So the exchange that I've included, someone simply asks, "What language do you use to describe yourself?" The other person responds, "I'm autistic and blind." Then they ask if they should use that language to describe them too. And when that person confirms, they just utilize that language going forward. So that's usually what I recommend for folks who are concerned about, they don't want to say the wrong thing. I also like to bring light to the fact that this has already changed several times. So, what is and is not the right thing, that is constantly evolving, which I think is actually really wonderful. And I want to delve a little deeper into mental health diagnoses and identity specifically. So these disabilities, like attentional and learning disorders, they're sometimes referred to as invisible disabilities. And that's in contrast to visible disabilities, marked by usually assistive technology and mobility aids. So some examples would be the use of wheelchairs, hearing aids, canes. And this sometimes allows us within the invisible disability community to have the privilege to pass as someone who does not have disabilities. And it gives us the choice whether or not we want to come out by naming our diagnoses and access needs. But the flip side of this is that there's a really unique stigma against disabilities that are not readily apparent in that way. So when someone sees a wheelchair user, they can often project their basic access needs. So, okay, if they're using a wheelchair, I'm going to just assume that they need a ramp, that they need, an elevator. They decide that for them. But they might not do the same for someone with invisible disabilities that doesn't share this information forthright. Furthermore, many of us with mental illnesses have been told that our access needs are less legitimate than for those with physical disabilities. So not only are people not making that assumption, which could actually be sometimes helpful, sometimes that comes from being told over and over again, oh, if it's not this thing, that's not really as big of a deal. Personally, I will say I do feel the tide changing a little bit in terms of that stigma, but it's a slow change. But I still wanted to highlight some of those changes. So one example of that is the Mad Pride movement. So this started in Canada in the 1990s. Mad Pride demonstrates the empowerment of users of mental health services and those with a history of psychiatric disabilities who are reclaiming the derogatory word mad as a sense of pride. That's something they're proud of. And because I work in colleges, you can see I never left school, I'm still a student, just to place the conversation among college students a little bit. The National Alliance on Mental Illness reports that 1 in 3 college students reporting prolonged periods of depression. This is all pre-COVID, and then 30% reported problems with schoolwork as a result of a mental health issue. So I would be remiss if I did not bring in the impact of COVID-19 pandemic on college students. Active Minds, which is a national student organization that was created by students with mental illness that has an active chapter here on campus, at Northeastern's campus. They conducted a survey in 2020 that found that 1 in 5 students said that their mental health was significantly worsened under COVID-19, and 80% of college students reported that COVID-19 negatively impacted their health. Excuse me. I hope that the urgency of this moment is very clear, and that, you know, this historical and personal perspective has helped to illuminate the disability identity for you today. So I know that we went through quite a bit today. I really appreciate you all making time for this. Please feel free to ask me any questions you might have, either by unmuting and sharing your question. You can also send a question in the chat. And if you wish to remain anonymous, you can direct message me, private message me a question, and I can answer it during this Zoom call, or afterwards. We can do that one-on-one. So as a reminder, my name is Ariel. Here's my Northeastern student email address, which is Lesnick, lesnick.a@northeastern.edu. So please stay in touch, again, with any questions you might have that, you know, didn't come up during this session. So I'm gonna stop my share. Okay, thank you.
I actually have a question. Yeah.
Great.
So it was really awesome to hear kind of the history of disability rights. In your opinion, how important is it for somebody, like, for example, I am blind. How important is it, do you feel like, that I should take it on as an identity? Can you talk a little bit more about like a personal relationship? Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry to cut you off, Mona. Yeah, I mean, here's what I'll say. It was very important to me. It's been very important and valuable to me. It shaped my entire trajectory. You know, this is something that started for me when I got that first diagnosis in college. I'm 20 years old, and I couldn't look back. Like, you know, there was this big kind of turning point for me when I got that diagnosis, and it just became a really big part of myself. And I had other identity markers that had previously kind of filled that role for me. So just to, you know, disclose more information, I'm a queer woman, I'm a Jewish woman, and those identities earlier in my life had been super central to me. So it became a very big deal for me. But something that I think is really great within the disability community is people making room for others. So you said, you know, yourself, oh, I'm a blind woman. That, if that's going to be a main identity marker for you, then you should use that as this primary source. But what I have seen that I really appreciate is a lot less of imposing what we want to do for ourselves on other people within the community, right? So like, even in that example, when we're talking about person preferred language, somebody might want to go by a person with autism or a person on the autism spectrum, and somebody else might say, right, I'm autistic, that's me, like, and that's my main thing and how I want to do it. And I really, really do appreciate that there's space for all of those ways to identify, to self-identify in the community.
I think you're absolutely correct. I think one of the most important things is to allow people to self-express the way they want to. I have been told that I should not say that I'm blind. And I'm like, no, but
Mm.
I personally identify myself as a blind woman. And I've been told,
Right.
no, you should be considered a person with blindness. No, like I get to choose how I identify myself. Everybody gets to.
Exactly.
So my other question for you, let's say there's somebody in the audience who might have an invisible disability and is really wary about maybe sharing that. Can you talk a little bit more, like give the rest of us insight about kind of that stigma that does occur? You kind of hinted at it too a little bit, but can you maybe, if you don't mind telling a little
Yeah.
bit about your story, like what is it that causes it to be stigma? How does society react to it? I don't, as you said, it's almost like I don't really have a choice. Like people are gonna react to me as a blind person when they see my cane, whether for good or for bad, and I don't almost have a choice in that. But talk a little bit more from the perspective of an invisible disability. I think it's interesting.
Yeah, happy to do so. So I think something that's important that I want to bring up is privilege, right? So I'm a white woman, and I'm saying I'm going to go out and self-disclose my disability identity to people. And that's something I feel safe doing. I feel safe and comfortable doing, knowing I know my rights really well because this is, my field, my professional field. So I know if I'm disclosing this to colleagues, even my own students, I know what I'm protected. I know I can't get fired because of this. That's from a place of incredible privilege that I feel so comfortable that I can say that. So sometimes for me, it feels more like an exercise of practicing what I preach, right? Like that I want to be making sure that I'm taking the time to do that as often as possible to show that as an example. Something that I did, which maybe is a little silly, but I said, I'm still in school. I'm a doctoral candidate now. I was a master's student, pretty much fresh out of undergrad. I always went to the disability services office on campus and got accommodations. I always did that. And when I was a master's student, those accommodations were completely irrelevant to my classes. Like they did not, it was about exams. I haven't taken an exam in years, but I wanted to keep doing that so I could know what that process was looking like for my students, so that I could tell them, here's what it's like to get that letter, and when do I decide to share that with my faculty and my classmates. So anyway, the thing with invisible disabilities is that, it's double-edged sword, a blessing and a curse, because it is a place of incredible privilege that I can decide in a lot of situations if I want to share that about myself. So I just decide to do it a lot. Like I do it a lot because I want others to see, that is okay. Because and this has happened to me so many times, so often with my own students. When I share, they say, oh, I have bipolar 2, and I say, oh, me too. I see it in them. They relax, they talk to me differently. And that is so rewarding. I'm getting like emotional and getting all choked up, but it really is so meaningful for me that I'm just going to keep doing it until, the world changes around me.
Nice, thank you.
Yeah, sure. Okay, I've got a question in the chat that was to everyone. So it says, have you worked with students who struggle to self-identify, and how have you helped them in these situations? I definitely have. A lot of times I do a lot of role playing in my work with students. So if they're struggling to self-identify, it's usually to a certain person. So a lot of times it's faculty, because I work in higher ed, but sometimes it's their, roommate in their dorm, and they say, they're not going to get a letter about all my academic accommodations, but I want them to know that I might need X, Y, and Z. And I have attentional difficulties. And when I hear that clock, that alarm clock they have that ticks, drives me, up a wall. It is so hard for me to focus and do this. So I put myself in that scenario, and I like to just go through every situation with them. I did it once. I remember when I was working at Northeastern, and I said, let's go through the absolute worst case scenario of what's going to happen when you tell your professor this. I'm going to be so rude. So just, getting it all out there. Please don't be concerned. I'm going to say, I don't care about their disability. Why would you tell me this? Or, I'm not going to change anything. And we went through that. And when we finished, they were like, oh, I feel so much better. That was the worst case scenario. Like, that's what they said. And I could still come back to you and, ask you to speak with the professor too, and include me in that conversation. Oh, that's not so bad. So I do a lot. I do definitely have this situation with students, and I just get very into to that role playing. I did, improvisational comedy when I was in college too. I think those skills sometimes come in handy, but just getting in the scene with them. So we do a lot of workshopping in that space. I've got another question in for Mona that says, can you talk more about the term identity marker and how this functions in between a person and their society or community? Yeah, so I mentioned identity marker, and I said that for me, my disability is a primary identity marker for me. And then I mentioned when I was talking to Mona, that I have other identity markers. So it depends on the circumstance. Sometimes if I'm in a queer space, the thing that the person in that space is, looking for me to share with them is how I factor into the queer community, not necessarily in the disability community. Or again, if I'm, at a Jewish holiday service, that they're not looking for more information about my, sexual orientation. They just want to know if I, remember the Hebrew prayer that I'm supposed to be saying in synagogue or whatever. So I do think that your primary or one's primary identity marker can shift depending on the circumstance. But I also think that you can have one that in general is kind of this primary thing. And, I to go back to Mona's example, as a blind woman, that is, I'm going to say, when we have these visible disabilities, that's going to be likely the first thing people are perceiving about you. So that sometimes we don't get the choice to decide what our primary identity marker is. And I know that, again, I'm a white woman. I know that people of color often say, yeah, the fact that I'm, a Black woman isn't the main thing about me. That's not my main identity. I'm a dance instructor and I want people to see me that way. I'm a lesbian and that's my most important thing. But they're seeing, your skin color before everything else and deciding things. So sometimes we don't have the choice of what is our primary identity marker, if that makes sense. So hopefully that answered your question, Mona. I see another question in the chat. I found that there's some gatekeeping in the community over which mental illnesses can be considered a disability, especially for high functioning individuals who may not need accommodations. Do you have any thoughts on if all mental illness, so parentheses, generalized anxiety, depression, etc., should be considered a disability? Yeah, this is a totally personal choice. I think they all should be considered disabilities. And the reason I think that is because when you use that disability that's when you get protections. So that's when you're covered by the Americans with Disabilities Act. That's when you could be eligible for accommodations from an office like mine. So I do feel that they should all be considered that, because in our current structure, society and legislatively, that's how you're going to get protection. I know that there are folks that say, they don't like that term, disability. It sounds negative to them. And that's not how they want to identify. And once again, I'm never going to tell somebody how they should identify. But from my perspective, doing that is what's going to get you insured access. And that's a primary goal of mine. So I'm always going to say yes. I do agree with that gatekeeping, though, that, if you're perceived as somebody who doesn't need accommodations or doesn't need these other kind of visible forms of support, a personal care aid or, you know, a hearing aid or something like that, I still think they should do it. That's my personal opinion. A faculty member asks, what can we as faculty do to make students feel more comfortable disclosing their disability? Great question. You know, I know at Northeastern, because I'm a student there, it is mandatory that you include information about, you know, the office on campus that provides accommodations. I think that is so important. I don't know how many professors are doing like a, you know, full syllabus day on the first day of class or what, but I think definitely bringing that up at the beginning of the term, and reminding, if you're a course that has exams and different assessments at each time when you're announcing an assignment or an exam, reminding people that if they have accommodations and they might need to make arrangements, so maybe they need to take an exam in another location for extended time, just reminding them at every point. So not just putting it in the syllabus, which I'm very happy to say is a mandatory thing, but drawing attention to it at the beginning of the course and then reinforcing that at other points, because I can just tell you personally, students have a sense, they might not have a running list, but they have a sense of who they feel is, you know, someone they feel more comfortable with, more comfortable disclosing, more comfortable talking about some, you know, how their accommodations need to be implemented. They've got a sense of that. So just creating that open space and constantly reminding, you know, again, if you've got an exam, you know, this exam's coming up on Friday, don't forget if you have an accommodation to do this, and saying that to the whole class as opposed to singling out those students, because especially at the college level, you know, students have a lot more autonomy in disclosing any information. The accommodations that professors are notified about don't include rationale, if that makes sense. So you'll say you have extended time, but it won't say because of ADHD. So making sure to not single out those students that you know have disabilities and you know have accommodations, but saying it to the whole class, that's just going to create just a more inclusive environment. Okay, there's a lot of great questions here. Again, I'm so pleased with this level of participation and engagement on such a snowy day here. It's really generous. Thank you so much.
Do we have any other questions?
I see another one in the chat. Sorry, Claire.
Hey,
you go first.
I think I've been trying to like write up a formulated question in writing, but like it's not working out. And I'm just really thinking about, I mean, the impact of COVID-19 on students, on campuses, and just the entire student experience is something that, of course, is on everybody's minds. But I'm just wondering about, you know, in your experience at Northeastern, in your current role, and just maybe conversations across, you know, disability services and you know, the workspace, kind of what like new best practices or additional ways of supporting students and like accessing resources that I think, you know, and thank you for sharing your own personal experience of navigating, accessing accommodations really for the first time in college. I know from, you know, in working with my students too, so many students are experiencing for possibly the first time the need to kind of reach out, and, you know, COVID-19 is directly impacting that experience and just maybe leading to being diagnosed for the first time or just accessing accommodations. And so I'm just wondering, you know, how have accommodations even been changing in response to COVID-19? What are kind of best practices that have come up in supporting students through that process as well?
Great question. So yeah, it's definitely been at the forefront. of course, in the field that we're in. And I think there have been actually a lot of positives. So here we are it's supposed to be a hybrid session. We were able to pretty seamlessly transition into an entirely remote presentation today, almost without missing a beat. We've got our ASL interpreters here. We've got captions. We got used to these things because of the pandemic. So people in the disability community have been advocating for this for a long time, and they were told at a lot of different places, not just in higher ed, but in a lot of different places, that's not reasonable. That's too much. We don't have it. We don't have the resources, figure out some other way. And then when it affected everybody, what do you know? We changed that on a dime, and we were able to figure this out. And we all, together fumbled through our first Zoom meetings and Teams calls and all that. So what I think we should be doing is really keeping our foot on the gas. So even as we see in a great way, the effects of COVID-19 really lessening in some regards, post-vaccine, booster, like in some ways, we are seeing, we're not going to have a return to normal, but you know what I mean? Things are the restrictions are a little bit lessened. We should still have remote options or hybrid options for events. We should still have captioning for all videos. Again, this is something that we were doing at the Disability Resource Center at Northeastern. We were doing this before, but with COVID has just really exposed it on a national scale. And I want us to keep it going, to keep that up. And the other thing, when I'm specifically thinking of mental illness, which a lot of students, that's like a new identity, not to mention the fact, I didn't even get into this, but the primary ages that someone would be diagnosed with a mental illness is between 18 and 24, which sounds remarkably similar to when a lot of students are in college. So that was already something that was going to be there. But what I really like, again, I think that COVID exposed this in a good way. Wellness, that's kind of like a buzzword. We're talking about that now. Companies started talking about that. When I was at Northeastern, we had 2 wellness days. That only took a couple of months to get off the ground and to have a full day of programming and to have all those departments coming together. It's possible. We can do these things. So just remembering that some of these things that we did in response to COVID, we should keep having available. We should keep that level of access. And I think that would be helpful. I'm sorry, I went on a bit of a tangent, Claire. Do you feel like I gave you enough tangible?
No, it was a necessary one. Yes, okay. I did. Yeah, I think that the session last week, questions came up about, if a student doesn't have the process of maybe having their accommodations approved can take a while, and something can kind of come up in the middle of the semester. There's just so many factors that come into play for the student. And I think, just making sure that we are supporting, whether it's in a staff position, an advising capacity, in a faculty capacity, but really at the institutional level. Like, I think you brought up a lot of very clear, inclusive ways to support, in a consistent way, just not now, but, continually moving forward, students during this time. So Thank you.
I'm relieved. Yeah, not a problem. So another question that was in the chat was, what do you recommend if insufficient accommodations are offered by your institution? Are there any outside resources you can recommend? So this is kind of a partial answer. Sometimes what I'm recommending for my own students that I'm providing accommodations for, who may feel like they wish there was more, is other resources covered by the institution. So it can be a little patchwork quilt-esque. So sometimes what a student is asking for, the kind of support they might want academically, is actually something that could be something they work with a peer tutor on, or something that they have an appointment with a research librarian. Again, all of these things still covered by the institution, but might not be coming as a the accommodation approved by, a disability resource office on campus. So sometimes I'm giving them a couple of different places within the institution. I'm always going to want to start there, especially from a cost perspective. So I am wary of recommending outside resources if they may or may not be covered by, a student's insurance, or, they might not be financially feasible. So I can think of some examples like students who might have difficulties with executive functioning. There's kind of a market for executive functioning coaches who I think can be really great and provide so much, but I'm not, like I said, I'm wary of recommending things that cost money as my first go-to. If they feel like their needs aren't being met with their accommodations. The other thing I'd like to, again, I'm a person making decisions about accommodations. And if a student says that they feel like their needs are not being met by the accommodations they got approved by the office, they can appeal that decision. They can say, I feel like this wasn't sufficient. And I do encourage our students to take that up the chain. If there's a formal appeal process that is part of this, I'm not going to direct a student to do that if I feel really strongly that that decision isn't going to change. So I'm not going to tell them to do this kind of pointless thing where they say they absolutely need this and it goes to a higher committee and then they get a decision that says, yeah, we're upholding this decision. I'm not going to recommend that. But if I think, there is a chance that that decision could be overturned and they could get the accommodation that they're seeking out, they should utilize their rights, even if it means, appealing a decision made from the office I work in. I will still recommend a student do that because that is within their rights. So my definite go-to is going to be to try to find those in other ways from the institution. And I'll offer to help, especially at a school the size of Northeastern. What they always say about schools like this, that departments can be siloed. They might not know where to go. So I won't just say, oh yeah, head over to peer tutors, you'll figure it out. I'll help them during that meeting that I'm with the student to make an appointment, to find where to go, schedule those things so that they can leave that space with like a tangible scheduled meeting or location that they're going to drop into to get those things. And then I'll tell them to follow up with me and check in because I'm not all knowing. So if they go there and that actually wasn't a good space for them and they didn't get that question answered or whatever, come back to me and let's do this again. And I think it's like I'm touched when students trust me enough to continue telling me when their needs aren't being met. It's like a comfort to me. Does that make sense? Does that feel good? Okay, thank you. I'm nodding. Thanks, Kelly. I appreciate it. Good question.
Do we have any other questions?
Okay. Joshua, I think you can call it.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Ms. Claire, thank you for bringing up the topic of COVID. So next Friday at 3 p.m., we are having a students roundtable discussion on the same topic, COVID and disabilities. So if any students out there, please attend next week's session. And if there are faculty and staff, please tell all the students to attend our event next Friday at 3 p.m. using the same Zoom link and also in room 655. It would be great if students join huge numbers and, we have a great student discussion on COVID and disabilities. And also, everyone can join and participate in the event. I also have a survey for this event. I'm sending out the link right now. And I'm also sharing the QR code. Please take a minute to fill out the survey for our project. I also request you all to visit disabilityawareness.sites.northeastern.edu. It's our website. We keep posting about all the events and all the updates regarding disability in Northeastern. I once again thank Ms. Ariel for this wonderful session you're giving us. We're really happy to have you. And I also thank every one of you for joining us this session. Just a minute and we'll wind this up. I'm just sharing the QR code. Please do scan it, and it's just a very small 1 minute survey. The form link is also in the chat below. So I especially thank the ASL interpreters and the media captioners for assisting us in all the events. We're really happy to have you.
Thank you all so much. So appreciate it.
Thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ariel, for coming. I really appreciate it. And thank you, Josh. And thanks to everybody else.